Great. Thanks so much, Radwan, for having me. And thank you to the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for hosting this conversation. As many of you know, CSID has really been at the forefront of these conversations from the early 2000s. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I'll just start by saying, first of all, that I'm very frustrated and pessimistic about U.S. foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East. And part of the reason I wanted to write this book is I wanted to lay out a fully fledged vision of what a democracy promotion policy could look like in the Middle East. If we really got serious about supporting democracy in the region, how would we do it? What would it look like? And of course, there's a theoretical argument of why we should support democracy in the first place. And I think that US policy, it's flawed at such a fundamental level that we can no longer talk about tinkering around the margins. So it's not about how we can make slight improvements to Middle East policy. We have to really go back to basics and think about the entire edifice upon which US policy in the Middle East has been based for really decades, from the 1950s onwards. So it's a very deep-seated problem and dilemma. And I think we really have to get serious about talking about these very basic problems in our approach. And the Middle East is worth focusing on. Obviously, the three of us on the panel focus on the Middle East, but the Middle East has also been ground zero for democratic dilemmas. And by democratic dilemmas, I mean, we as Americans, we say we want democracy in theory, but we're not comfortable with democracy's outcomes in practice. And we've seen this for several decades now. And really, in one way or another, we've been having this debate about democracy in the Middle East from the early 1990s. We had the 1991 elections in Algeria, where an Islamist party was on the verge of coming to power. A coup followed. The 1995 elections in Turkey, where an Islamist party came to power for the first time, followed by a coup a year later. The 2006 elections in Palestine, where Hamas came to power. And then, of course, the Arab Spring, where Islamist parties came to power in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere. And unfortunately, there have been coups in both of those countries as well. So if you're sensing a pattern, well, that's because there is a pattern. Now, you know, why are we so uncomfortable with Arab democracy if we're talking about American policymakers and observers? Part of it has to do with a misunderstanding of the democratic idea. That's part of what I argue in the book. Because we think democracy is good, we assume that it should lead to good outcomes. But in the Middle East, it doesn't lead to quote unquote good outcomes. At least they're not good outcomes if you're an American liberal. And here I mean a classical liberal. So obviously in the case of Egypt, Tunisia, Palestine, Algeria, who came to power or was about to come to power through free and fair elections? It was illiberal parties, Islamist parties that believed to one degree or another that Islam and Islamic law should play a central role in public life. So part of what I try to do in my work more generally, but specifically in this book, is to offer up a resolution to this dilemma. And I believe we can resolve this dilemma by prioritizing democracy over liberalism when the two are in tension. And that's a broader philosophical debate. I know Mustafa will have a strong position on that. So I think we'll get to some of that later. The American discomfort with Islamists coming to power through elections has to do with a couple different things. Some of it has to do with culture and ideology, because if you think about US policymakers, most of them are secular or liberal elites. They're not very comfortable with the idea of religion playing a prominent role in public life. And even if they're more familiar with Christianity, as say the Bush administration was during the Freedom Agenda in the 2000s, there is no real equivalent to Islamist parties in the Christian tradition, and there's no equivalent to Sharia in the Christian tradition. So that makes it hard for Americans to really get their head around the prospect of Islamists coming to power. And then there's also the question of interests. Part of the reason that Americans are skeptical of Islamist parties is that Islamist parties oppose the US-led regional order. But part of why Islamists oppose the US-led order is because they see the US as propping up authoritarian regimes. So we kind of get in this cycle where the US isn't willing to move forward and get serious about a democracy promotion policy because of the way the entire regional structure is oriented and the perception that Islamist parties are anti-American and anti-Israel. And I mention Israel here because Israel does figure increasingly into my thinking. When the Arab Spring started, I was actually quite skeptical of what's called linkage theory, the idea that Israel's role in the Middle East is the fundamental problem, the central dilemma. But over time, and especially as I was doing more research on this book, I kept on coming back to an interesting role that Israel plays in the American imagination. And just to give one example, in the 1990s, when much of the rest of the world was experiencing democratic transitions in Latin America, East Asia, and so on, the Middle East was the one place where this was not happening. And it's worth looking at why. Jordan was one of the most promising cases. There was actually the start of a democratic transition in 1989, but then the Muslim Brotherhood won 22 out of 80 seats in the 89 elections. Now, fast forward a couple of years, in 1993, King Hussein wants to prioritize a peace treaty with Israel, which he did ultimately sign a year later in 94. But he thought to himself, well, there's a problem that Parliament won't ratify the treaty, and Parliament's dominated by the Brotherhood, other Islamists, and leftists and nationalists who are all against the peace treaty. So he started a closing of democratic space, and he instituted a new electoral law that basically made it impossible for the opposition to win. 1993 marks the end of Jordan's democratic experiment. But what's interesting is that after 1993, the US significantly increased military and economic aid to Jordan. So to be clear about this, just as Jordan is becoming significantly more authoritarian, US support increases dramatically. That is not a mistake. It's precisely by design. Now, fast forward to the Arab Spring, and here's where I'll begin to close up and try to offer a way forward on some of these issues. Is in the book, I try to reconstruct the days and months leading up to the 2013 coup in Egypt, which I see as the defining moment, really the end of the Arab Spring. And if you look at what Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said in retrospect, and I'll give an example here, he was reflecting on this period, and he said that he agreed with Saudi and Emirati claims that the Brotherhood was quote unquote dangerous and had to be countered. And we also have some reporting on what Hagel said to Sisi several days before the coup. He said this, quote unquote, he told Sisi this: "So I will never tell you how to run your government or how to run your country. You do what you have to do to protect your security, to protect your country." And that was reported in David Kirkpatrick's book, Into the Hands of the Soldiers. So that amounted to basically a green light to Sisi that the US wouldn't push back if he proceeded with a coup. And for the interviews in my book, I interviewed senior Obama administration officials, and they confirmed some of these things. And there's some good quotes that I have, but one example is a White House official who was on several of the calls between Hagel and Sisi said this. He said, Shadi, quote unquote, look, between us, Chuck Hagel was a disaster on pretty much every level, literally incompetent. So relying on him to deliver these kinds of messages to Sisi was a major mistake. Obviously, he didn't really want to do it, and he wasn't going to take a hard line. Anyway, you get the picture. There's a lot of examples of this. So when we try to, we didn't try to stop the coup, and I believe we could have. But more broadly, I think that there was an opportunity at crucial moments during the Arab Spring to use what I call maximal leverage. So I do try to think through what the most proactive, even aggressive approach might have been with some of these authoritarian leaders like Sisi. And one example, and we talk about this more, is that at a very fundamental level, if we wanted to ground the Egyptian military, we could, not overnight, but we could do it in the matter of weeks and months by suspending spare parts maintenance, and equipment, logistical training, and to the Egyptian military. So quite literally, they wouldn't be able to run their jets and tanks, and China and Russia can't provide a substitute because of the interoperability of weapon systems. The same goes for the Saudi military. If we wanted to ground the Saudi Air Force, we could immediately suspend spare parts and maintenance to our Saudi counterparts. We have never actually tried to do anything approaching this. So what I call maximal leverage has never been attempted. So when people say that we try to support democracy in the Middle East, whether it's the freedom agenda under the Bush administration in the 2000s or during the Arab Spring, they're simply wrong about this. There has never been a sincere, serious attempt to promote democracy in the Middle East that lasted more than a few months. At best, we can say that the freedom agenda under George W. Bush for about 15 months in 2004, 2005, we got kind of serious and we started to go in that direction. But then, of course, we know what happened. Islamist parties started doing very well in Egypt, Bahrain, Lebanon in 2005. And then, of course, Hamas won in 2006. That was the end of the freedom agenda as we know it. The last thing I'll say is simply this. External factors matter a lot. What the U.S. does or doesn't do does have a profound impact on the prospects for democracy in the Middle East. So we can talk as much as we want about grassroots and civil society and how in the end Arabs are the ones who have to fight for their freedom and democracy. Of course they do. But if they're fighting against their regimes and also against the patrons of those regimes, i.e. the U.S. and other Western powers, then they're fighting on two fronts. And that's a very difficult situation for them to be on. So I really do believe at this point that unless the U.S. Fundamentally reorients its policy in the Middle East, the prospects for Arab democracy will be very remote. That's really what it comes down to. So with that, thank you and look forward to the conversation.